Good morning, everyone. We're just gonna give folks a few seconds to start jumping on to the webinar. Thanks for joining us. Good number of folks joining. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. We have two wonderful speakers joining us this morning, and we hope to hear from you all and your questions. So, welcome to our fifth webinar in our Economic Mobility Learning Series. So glad you're with us. We hope that you'll try to set aside the multitasking if you can and come ready with your questions. And before I turn it over, I just want to re-ground us in the Greater Houston Community Foundation, why economic mobility has become central to our work, and how this series fits into something bigger that's building in Houston right now. The Community Foundation exists to inspire and create meaningful and positive change with our donors and for our community. We call ourselves Houston's philanthropic partner because that's exactly what we do. We work alongside individuals, families, businesses, advisors, foundations, and nonprofits to direct generosity where it can do the most good. And over the last 30 years, our donors and partners have collectively given more than $3 billion to nonprofit organizations that improve lives and strengthen communities. But we believe our role extends beyond grant making by leveraging data, trusted relationships with incredible partners, and our ability to convene and catalyze. We are focused on turning generosity into sustained progress. I have the privilege of working with an incredible team leading the Community Foundation's community impact work comprised of three core initiatives. First, Understanding Houston, our regional indicator platform launched in partnership with Rice University's Kinder Institute for Urban Research that roots us all in credible data about where Houston is thriving and where we're falling short. Second, the Greater Houston Disaster Alliance, where we partner with United Way of Greater Houston, government leaders, and a trusted network of more than 100 nonprofit partners to improve our region's response to disaster recovery and resilience. And third, our high impact grant making initiative, which makes it easier for our donors and partners to invest together in the most promising solutions to Houston's pressing challenges with a focus on economic mobility. Last year, you might recall that Houston made headlines as the most impoverished major city in the US. In Harris County, nearly 1 in 4 children lives in poverty, and research shows that poverty often persists across generations, with about 1 in 3 children who grow up in poverty remaining there as an adult. More broadly, only about half of children in the US will earn more than their parents, signaling a decline in intergenerational economic mobility. And these realities have implications not only for our children and families, but also, of course, for Houston's future workforce, our economic competitiveness, and long-term prosperity. The barriers facing low-income families are complex, interconnected, and deeply persistent. And we believe that meeting this challenge requires a response that is equally ambitious, coordinated, and sustained. And that brings us to where we are this morning. Last fall, Houston leaders from across sectors came together for an inaugural Economic Mobility Summit. And the energy in that room sparked something. Community partners leaning in on one of the most defining challenges of our time. Why is it so hard for so many people in our region to get ahead? And what can we actually do about it? Those conversations led us as co-conveners to explore the potential of establishing a Houston Economic Mobility Coalition, a cross-sector effort committed to advancing economic mobility at scale. And as we do that work, we know we can't build in a vacuum. One of the clearest things we heard from summit participants was we want to keep learning. People wanted to know what's working in other cities, what the research is telling us, what lessons and solutions might we draw on to inform what we build together. And this series is our answer to that call. Through it, we'll hear from leaders in other communities who have built and tested approaches to improving economic mobility. We'll learn about the latest research. And none of this is to copy and paste or to pretend that something in Utah is directly relevant exactly as is to Houston, because Houston is a special place, let's get real. But it is to say that we want to learn faster, be as smart as we can as Houston writes its own story. So we're excited to have David Forte and Matthew Staiger here with us today from Opportunity Insights. They're doing groundbreaking research identifying barriers and scalable solutions to improving economic mobility. David Forte is the Director of Research and Translation Strategic Initiatives at Opportunity Insights, where he focuses on building out strategic activities that bring impact and evaluation. Oh, sorry, that bring the research into practice. Prior to Opportunity Insights, David led impact and evaluation efforts focused on housing and homelessness, and he holds a master's degree from the University of Washington. Matthew Steiger is a research scientist at Opportunity Insights and a co-author on the Hope 6 research you'll hear about more today. Matthew received his PhD in economics from the University of Maryland, and his research investigates the determinants of economic mobility with the goal of identifying policies that can effectively promote upward mobility. We're excited to hear about their latest findings about the study of the Hope 6 housing program and its implications for how we can develop effective solutions at scale in our communities to improve upward mobility. So, with that, I'll turn it over to David and Matthew.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Diana. We are just thrilled to be a part of this webinar series. I think it's been really, really informative. I've got this on a few of these now. So we're just excited to be with you all today to talk more about the research. Um, Make sure my slides are shared. So as Diana said, my name is David Forte. I lead our research translation efforts at Opportunity Insights. And I'll just give a quick overview of OI and a little bit about the research of the geography of opportunity before I hand things over to Matt to talk more about Hope 6. So Opportunity Insights, we are a research and policy lab based at Harvard University focused on one key question. How can we expand economic opportunity for more children, more families, more people throughout the US and communities where they live? And our work generally follows three stages. So the first is that we use large-scale administrative data to understand where opportunity exists and where it doesn't, looking at things like geographies, population groups by race, ethnicity, gender, and those sorts of factors. Second, we use rigorous research methods to identify what actually causes those differences. And then finally, we work with governments and community partners to translate that evidence into practical policy solutions and interventions that can help improve opportunity in communities across the US. So today I'd like to briefly just walk through one example of that, how that research and this research agenda has evolved over the past decade. So for those of you who are familiar with our work, I think this map will look quite familiar for you. And one of the foundational findings that really came out of OI's early work was that childhood environments matter enormously in terms of shaping those adulthood outcomes. So if you look across the United States, what we see in terms of economic mobility is that children with very similar financial circumstances in their households end up having tremendously different outcomes later on in life, depending on where they spent the most time growing up. So in this map that you see on the right, we can see areas that are shaded red. These represent areas in the US where low-income children have lower outcomes in adulthood. The blue or green areas represent areas where children go on to have much stronger outcomes in adulthood. And these patterns also play out at the local level. So this is to say neighborhood by neighborhood, we see these same differences. You'll notice that the scale in the bottom right didn't change from the national map to the local map. So that is to say that living in one neighborhood versus the other in Houston, they may be adjacent to one another, but it can be the same thing as growing up in completely different parts of the United States. So once we establish that place matters through these mechanisms that we show here on the left about access to schools and safety in your neighborhood, the social networks, the labor markets you enter when you become an adult, the next logical question really became, well, what should we do about this information on this map? How can we take action with it? So over the past decade, our research has increasingly pointed towards one important set of policy levers, and that's really focused on how we can help families access neighborhoods that provide greater opportunity for children. So how can we help families that want to do so move to and live in these areas that we've identified as higher opportunity? And that story really unfolds across four different chapters. So the first was the Moving to Opportunity experiment and research, which demonstrated that children who moved to lower poverty neighborhoods at younger ages really had much better outcomes later on in life. So this was the first research that really established that neighborhood environments can have causal effects. Second was this chapter we call the Opportunity Atlas. So developing a tool that took that data on opportunity and mapped it down to the local level to allow practitioners and policymakers to be able to explore this data and understand what it looks like in their own local context. And then third, we asked a more practical question. So if we know where opportunity exists, can families realistically get there? Can they move to, if they want to these areas that provide greater opportunities for their children? So the Creating Moves to Opportunity demonstration, this showed that with some relatively modest supports, so things like housing navigation and landlord engagement, we can meaningfully help families that have housing choice vouchers, so a housing subsidy from the federal government, to be able to move to and access these higher opportunity neighborhoods should they want to do so. So taken together, this kind of arc of the research really points towards us understanding that a really important policy lever that we have is to reduce barriers to neighborhood choice for low-income families that want to make those types of moves. However, I think one of the biggest criticisms from this particular policy strategy alone is that this is not a scalable solution when we think about expanding opportunity for families at large, right? For a number of different reasons, right? Practically, it just doesn't make sense. You can't move families all that are from low-income backgrounds to these higher opportunity areas. And it may not make sense for families to do that, right? For a variety of different reasons, whether they have family that's close by or jobs or friends that keep them in the neighborhoods where they grew up. So to have a truly durable mobility strategy, you have to have both this concept that we've established around expanding geographic choice for families, but also being able to increase opportunity, improve opportunity in places where it's historically been lacking. So the question really isn't around choice or place-based investments, but really how can we do both of these things together? So today we have the opportunity to hear from one of our researchers, Matt, who has really helped push forward this next chapter of the evidence at Opportunity Insights. He's spent years studying the long-term impacts of the Hope 6 program, asking questions like what happens when we invest in neighborhoods themselves and how can those investments affect children's life trajectories. So with that, Matt, I will turn it over to you to go deeper into the Hope 6 results.
Perfect. Thanks so much for teeing this up, and thank you all for taking the time to be here. Um, okay, let's see. Hopefully, you can all see my screen well. Okay, so as David mentioned, I'm planning on sharing a summary of the findings from a recent research paper that we've put out with the team at Opportunity Insights. So the paper is titled Creating High Opportunity Neighborhoods, Evidence from the Hope 6 Program. And this is joint work with a large team. So Raj Chetty, Rebecca Diamond, Brad Foster, Larry Katz, Sonia Porter, and Laura Tack all contributed to this work. So I think David kind of teed up this project nicely, but the kind of basic premise was, prior to the study, we just didn't have much evidence of kind of how or even really whether it was possible to fundamentally expand economic opportunity in distressed neighborhoods to kind of change opportunity in a given place. And so what we did in this project was we went back and we studied one of the largest neighborhood revitalization programs in recent US history. And that program is the Hope 6 Revitalization Program. So Hope 6 was a large federal program that targeted distressed high poverty public housing projects. It allocated $16.7 billion across 262 sites between 1993 and 2010. And these funds were used to demolish old public housing projects and build new mixed income communities. So just to give you kind of a concrete sense of what the program did, here on the left, I'm showing an image from the Allen Parkway Village public housing project, which is located in Houston. Some of you may be familiar with this area. So this is a project that got Hope 6 grant in the early 90s. And this image is taken just before receiving one of these grants. And so prior to the intervention, Allen Parkway Village was pretty typical of Hope 6 sites in the sense that it was a very segregated community. So virtually everyone who lived in these housing units was poor by virtue of the fact that they were recipients of public housing. And even just the kind of physical built architecture of these buildings kind of set the residents apart from the surrounding community. It was very obvious where the public housing development began and ended. If we fast forward in time, here on the right, I'm showing you an image of that exact same neighborhood taken after revitalization. And so you can see things are just dramatically different. So now the kind of physical quality of the housing is much better. The neighborhood architecturally blends a bit more seamlessly into the surrounding areas. And while this didn't happen specifically on Allen Parkway, in many of the Hope 6 sites, the new housing units were reserved for a mix of public and non-public housing. And so kind of the broad idea of Hope 6 was to transform these very segregated communities into more economically integrated places where folks in public housing would live alongside and interact with individuals who are relatively higher income. And so, it's pretty obvious looking at these types of before and after pictures that Hope 6 had a big impact on kind of the built environment. What we set out to do in this research project is to answer the following question. Did Hope 6 improve opportunity in targeted neighborhoods? So in other words, if you were to take a set of kids in public housing and assign them to live in the neighborhood on the left or grow up in the neighborhood on the right, would you ultimately end up observing differences in the long run outcomes between those two groups of kids? So that's what we're going to tackle in this paper. Before kind of telling you what we find, I'll just briefly provide an overview of kind of the data sources and the methods that we use to tackle this problem. So we're going to combine data from two sources, so specifically IRS tax returns and administrative data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Together, these data sets are going to allow us to observe everyone who lives in public housing, and then we can track the outcomes of those people in the tax records over time. In terms of a research design, so if we were to set this up as an ideal study, what we would have loved to have done is to run a randomized controlled trial. And so kind of if you think back to your middle school or high school science classes, in a randomized controlled trial, the idea is that you would take a big set of public housing projects, you'd kind of randomly split those projects into two groups. One group would get the Hope 6 award. That would be our treatment group. And then one group would have no intervention. That would be the control group. And then in a randomized control trial, the only difference between those two groups is the intervention. And so all you have to do to estimate the impact of the intervention is to compare the outcomes between those two groups. So in practice, Hope 6 wasn't run as a randomized controlled trial. And indeed, the federal government specifically targeted some of the most kind of distressed, disadvantaged communities in the country. However, because of limited funding, there ended up being lots of similar projects that didn't receive a Hope 6 grant. And so what we're going to do is leverage that fact and try to recreate the conditions of a randomized controlled trial. So specifically what we'll do is we're going to go back to the years prior to Hope 6. And for each project that received a Hope 6 grant, we're going to find another project that looked identical in terms of its observable characteristics. So it was the same size, the residents looked similar in terms of their income, their racial composition, and so on. So in that way, we construct kind of a treatment and a control group. We're then going to follow those two groups of projects over time. And by comparing how these two groups of neighborhoods, the treatment and control group, change, we'll be able to estimate the impact of the Hope 6 program. So that's kind of the basic research design. So what do we find? I'm going to start off by showing you how Hope 6 impacted the economic outcomes of the adults in these communities. So our first question was just to try to understand whether Hope 6 changed the income composition in these neighborhoods. So to do that, what we do is we draw a boundary around exactly where the original footprint of the public housing project was located. And then we're simply going to, in each year, identify the adults who live in this area and measure the average income of those individuals. So the average income is what I'm plotting on the vertical axis. And then I'm going to show you how that changes between 10 years before and 15 years after the grant. So what this figure shows in the blue series um, is that prior to the intervention, the average income of the adults in this neighborhood was about $13,000. So, the adults living in the Hope Six public housing sites were quite low income. And the neighborhoods were pretty stable in the years leading up to the intervention. After the intervention, the original public housing buildings were demolished, and then new housing units were built in their place. And as people start to move into those new housing units, we see a dramatic increase in the average income of the folks who are living in these neighborhoods, such that 15 years after the award, we see about a 45% increase in the average income of the adults. So, this series here shows that Hope Six did achieve one of its primary stated objectives, which was to kind of reduce poverty rates in these neighborhoods or increase the economic diversity of the residents. However, it did so by changing the set of people who lived here. So, um, in many Hope Six sites, what happened is that these new housing units that were rebuilt were reserved for a mix of, some public housing units, on average about two-thirds public housing, but then some non-public housing units. Units built through LIHTC or market rate units. And it turns out that these income gains that we're seeing here are entirely driven by higher income families moving in to the non-public housing units. And so, one way that you can see this is to go back and look at the impacts of the adults who originally lived in the Hope Six public housing projects. So what we do is we go back, to the year before the grant was awarded, find the adults who are living in the Hope Six sites, and we track those individuals over time, measuring their incomes regardless of where they live. So that's what I'm showing you in the orange series, and you can see that there's no impact for the original adult residents. And so, the kind of key takeaway from the impacts on adults is that Hope Six had, somewhat mixed success. On the one hand, it did achieve its kind of one of its primary stated objectives, which was to, increase the average income in these neighborhoods, reduce poverty rates in these targeted neighborhoods. But it did so by changing the mix of people who lived in these places, not by improving the incomes of adults living in public housing. For kids, we see a very different story, and so that's where I'll turn my attention next. Um, so what we're going to do for kids is we're going to start off by trying to get a sense of what these communities were like prior to the intervention. So to do that, this is what we're going to do in this figure, and to be concrete, let me describe exactly how we construct this estimate on the far left. So to construct that estimate, what we do is we go back 10 years prior to the Hope Six grants, and we find kids who are living in these projects, but who had moved away at least 1 year before the intervention. So these are, prior residents of these communities, kids who used to live in these places, but who moved away before the intervention, and so were therefore not directly impacted by Hope Six. For these kids, we then track them into adulthood using the tax records, and we measure their incomes at age 30. And so what this point on the left is showing is that we find that these prior residents, kids who used to live in these neighborhoods 10 years before, on average, earned about $23,000 at age 30. And so this gives us some sense of kind of what these neighborhoods were like prior to the intervention. We can see that the kind of income of these kids remains persistently low in the years leading up to the Hope Six intervention. When we now flip forward in time, we see a very different story. So here what we're doing is we're now looking at kids who move into the new revitalized public housing units and then measuring their incomes. And what we can see is this dramatic increase in the average incomes of the kid, about a 15% increase in their incomes. And so this figure shows that kids who lived in the revitalized projects after Hope Six tended to earn much more in adulthood relative to the kids who lived there before. That's kind of an important piece of evidence, some preliminary evidence that suggests that Hope Six may have fundamentally improved economic opportunity in these communities. However, there are two very different explanations for what could be driving this result. So on the one hand, this could be about the causal effects of place. Perhaps Hope Six, fundamentally improved these neighborhoods, and because of that, the kids growing up in the new public housing projects may have been set on a stronger life trajectory that led them to earn more as adults. So that's one explanation. A different explanation is one of kind of selection into these new revitalized units. So it's possible that the types of families that moved into the revitalized public housing projects, um, they could be fundamentally different in a way that their kids would have earned more, kind of regardless of where they lived. And so, in order to kind of test between these two different stories, what we're going to do is make a comparison between kids who live in the same public housing project. So, to be concrete, consider a family who's moving into a Hope Six public housing project and who has two kids. An 8-year-old and a 17-year-old. The basic idea is that, well, the 17-year-old is only going to get kind of 1 year of the Hope Six treatment, whereas that 8-year-old is going to spend 10 years of childhood in that environment and get a much bigger dosage of the treatment. And so the idea is that if it's the case that Hope Six is fundamentally changing the causal effect of place, then what we would expect to find is that the younger sibling, the kids who spend more time in these public housing projects, that they're the ones who experience the larger gains. And indeed, that's exactly what we find in the data. So here what I'm showing is on the vertical axis, the long run impact of growing up in a Hope Six project. And on the horizontal axis, we're plotting that as a function of the number of years that kids spend in public housing. And so, what these estimates show is that if you spend, just a few years in the Hope Six sites, it doesn't have a dramatic impact on your adult income. Whereas if you spend kind of a decade in the Hope Six sites, you see much bigger impacts at age 30, an increase of about $6,000. So just to kind of put the magnitudes in perspective here, these estimates imply that if a child were to spend their entire childhood in a Hope Six revitalized project, that would increase their income at age 30 by about 50%. So, a really large increase in income, kind of fundamentally different life circumstances at that point. And so, taken together, we view that this evidence and, a lot more evidence that we discussed in the paper as, really compelling evidence that Hope Six kind of fundamentally changed the causal effect of growing up in these neighborhoods. So, these are large effects, but another way of kind of benchmarking or assessing the kind of magnitudes is to kind of compare them to the cost of the program. So Hope Six was a really expensive program. It required an upfront one-time cost of about $170,000 per revitalized unit to the taxpayer. But the gains were also large. So our estimates imply that each year that a family spends in a revitalized public housing unit will increase the lifetime income of their children by $25,000. So that's just for spending 1 year in one of these public housing developments. You can imagine that kind of as families spend more and more time in these sites, that those gains kind of add up very quickly. Indeed, over a 30-year horizon, our estimates imply that the children who grew up in those areas their earnings would increase by so much that they would end up paying almost $100,000 more in income tax over their lifetime, which is enough to offset much of the upfront cost of the program. And so, these types of calculations, I think, show that even though these programs can be require quite an expensive upfront investment, the gains are sufficiently large that it makes them actually compare favorably on a kind of cost effectiveness measure to other effective anti-poverty programs that we know of. I think this point about the kind of increased tax revenue is also relevant to thinking about how you might try to finance these programs. So many Hope Six sites used a tool called tax increment financing to leverage additional funds. And so tax increment financing, or TIF, is a strategy where governments can basically promise developers a share of a subsequent increased tax revenue from investments. In Hope 6 sites, that often involved thinking about increases in either property tax or sales tax. And one of the points that we make here is that, well, there's also a lot of tax revenue that's being generated from the income gains, and that this is potentially another source of kind of revenue and gains that governments and developers might think about tapping into to try to scale these types of interventions. Okay, so up till now we've shown that Hope 6 seemed to have a pretty big impact on the long run outcomes of the kids. I think that immediately raises the kind of next question, which is, what's going on here? What is the mechanism that is driving these gains in long run outcomes? So, there's many possible mechanisms through which Hope 6 could have affected the long run outcomes. What we're going to do in our analysis is to focus narrowly and specifically on one mechanism that has really been emphasized in the recent literature on neighborhood effects, and that's the role of social cross-class integration. So what we're going to do is, as a starting point, is estimate how the impact of the program varies with the kind of affluence of the nearby community. So in particular, what we're going to do is for each kid living in public housing, we're going to find the kids who live in the nearby community, and we're going to measure the average income of those kids who live nearby. So you can think of this as kind of like a measure of economic opportunity or affluence in the community that's outside of the public housing development. And specifically, we're going to look within kind of a 1 mile radius. So, these are kids who are really in the neighborhood and might be likely to interact with the kids in public housing. We then take that measure of the affluence or economic opportunity in the nearby neighborhood, and we just group the data into 3 buckets based on that metric: low, middle, and high. And with each of those buckets, we're going to estimate the long run impact of the program on kids' outcomes. So that's what I'm showing you here. And what you can see is that there's a very systematic pattern whereby we see larger impacts of the program when the surrounding neighborhood is more affluent or has more economic opportunity. One of the most striking findings of the paper is this finding over on the left, which shows that when Hope 6 sites were located in broader areas of disadvantage, we actually find no impact of the program. And so, that was quite surprising to us, even though this program, tore down really dilapidated old public housing units and built very high quality housing in many cases. The kids who grew up there did no better when the surrounding neighborhood was also quite low income. It's only in these cases on the right, when there's some economic opportunity to tap into, do we actually see evidence of gains. And so, that's a really important finding because it suggests that housing quality alone is not enough to move the needle on economic mobility. And rather, it starts to point to more of a kind of a social interaction, peer effects type of story. And so to kind of push on that mechanism, a second thing that we do is we look at impacts on direct measures of social interaction. And we do that in 3 ways. So first, we use data from the decennial censuses, which allows us to measure who people are living with. And what we show is that for kids who are growing up in Hope 6 revitalized public housing projects, that as adults, they end up being much more likely to live with their former neighbors. So the kids who kind of live nearby, an indication that kids in public housing are interacting more intensively with their nearby neighbors. Our second piece of evidence comes from anonymized cell phone records, cell phone GPS pings. And so using these data, we can basically track, we can find folks who are living in public housing based on where their cell phone is pinging at night. And then we can track those individuals during the day, those devices during the day, to measure where they're spending their time. And what we show is that residents of the Hope 6 revitalized public housing projects spend a significantly larger chunk of their time kind of in the nearby neighborhood, within like outside of the public housing development, but within a 1 mile radius. The third piece of evidence comes from Facebook, where we have this incredible ability to literally directly measure the social networks of individuals. And what we show is that kids from low-income families who are attending the high schools near Hope 6 projects, they become much more likely to form friendships with children from more affluent backgrounds. And so all of these pieces of evidence then point to a narrative in which prior to the intervention, these public housing projects were basically islands of disadvantage that were totally cut off from the surrounding community, such that kids in public housing were unlikely to interact with the kids who live nearby. What Hope 6 did at a fundamental level was to break down those barriers. And that led to the kids in public housing to interact more intensively with the kids who live nearby. When that surrounding community was a bit more affluent, when there was more economic opportunity in the surrounding area, that kind of integration, this cross-class integration, ended up leading to large benefits for the kids in public housing. Okay, so in the last section of the talk, I want to kind of um, step back from the specifics of Hope 6 and think about, whether Hope 6 teaches us something that's likely to be kind of relevant in a much broader context beyond distressed public housing. So the key question is whether Hope 6 sites were unusually isolated or whether this kind of social integration mechanism can be used more broadly to create economic opportunity. To tackle that question, what we do is we measure the extent to which each neighborhood in the US is socially integrated with its surrounding neighborhoods. And the key finding is that half of low-income neighborhoods are actually more isolated than Hope 6 sites were prior to revitalization. So in other words, there's lots of neighborhoods out there today that are very isolated and could potentially benefit from increased integration. But how do we know in these kind of broader contexts that if we were to integrate those communities, that we would see similar impacts as in the case of Hope 6? Well, one thing that gives us some confidence is that there appears to be a much broader connection between kind of economic mobility and social integration. So that's the point I'm making on this figure here. To construct this figure, what we've done is, for each neighborhood, we measure for each low-income neighborhood in the country, we measure the extent to which that neighborhood is socially integrated with kind of nearby affluent neighborhoods. Then on the horizontal axis, we're going to rank neighborhoods from isolated on the left to more integrated on the right. And then on the vertical axis, we're going to plot kind of the average income of the low-income kids who grow up in those communities. So a measure of upward mobility. This kind of strong positive association shows us that when low-income kids grow up in neighborhoods that are more integrated, that they tend to have much higher incomes in adulthood. So they do better in adulthood. Now, one thing that I think really affects the political feasibility of this type of integration intervention is whether there are kind of offsetting negative effects for the kids in the high income communities that are being integrated with. So in other words, is this a zero-sum world where integration leads to gains for low-income kids, but losses for high-income kids? We kind of assess that point directly by basically creating the mirror image of this figure, where what I'm doing on the right is now for each affluent neighborhood in the country, we measure the extent to which that neighborhood is integrated with nearby low-income neighborhoods. And so that kind of social integration index, again, is on the horizontal axis. Left is more isolated, right is more integrated. And then on the vertical axis, we're plotting the average outcomes of the high-income kids in those neighborhoods. And what you can see is a very different pattern where we actually don't see a very strong relationship between these two measures. So in other words, when high-income kids grow up in more or less integrated neighborhoods, they tend to have pretty similar outcomes. It doesn't really matter for the outcomes of the kids in high-income families whether their neighborhoods are more or less integrated. And so, taken together, what this suggests is that if one were to integrate low and high-income neighborhoods, that would generate large gains for the kids in low-income families without substantial losses for the kids in high-income families. And so, we think that this evidence then suggests that this type of what we call connection-based revitalization, basically neighborhood revitalization efforts that aim to connect isolated neighborhoods to the kind of broader community, that strategy is a really promising strategy for expanding economic opportunity at scale. And so, one of the things that we've done with this paper to help kind of, foster experimentation and future work in this area is to create this list of basically neighborhoods that given the data, we think are likely good candidates for this type of connection-based revitalization. So you can view the list on an interactive version of this Opportunity Atlas map on our website. Just to kind of walk through in a little bit of a detail what we're doing here. So this is the kind of Opportunity Atlas map that David mentioned. The blue areas are high mobility places, so places where kids growing up in low income families have a really good shot of kind of escaping poverty in the next generation. And the red areas are low mobility places, places where kids tend to get stuck in cycles of intergenerational poverty. The black dots then are overlaid on this map with the black dots. We're highlighting the neighborhoods that appear on our list. And so just to kind of zoom into your local context to Houston to show you exactly what's going on here. What we flagged in our list are neighborhoods that are low income, low opportunity neighborhoods. So these are poor neighborhoods where historically kids have tended to kind of really struggle in those environments, but that they're surrounded by more affluent communities. So you can see that the neighborhoods that are highlighted in black here are kind of these red, low opportunity neighborhoods that are located close to the blue, higher opportunity, more affluent places. So these are like exactly the types of environments where the research from Hope 6 suggests that efforts to integrate those low income and nearby affluent areas would generate really large gains for the low income kids. So um, just to point out kind of one example here, the kind of Acre Homes neighborhood and the North Houston neighborhood are neighborhoods that are right next to each other. But the kids who grow up in the North Houston neighborhood tend to have much higher income in adulthood, whereas kids who grow up in the Acre Homes neighborhood tend to get stuck in a cycle of poverty. So I think a key kind of next question for both practitioners and researchers working in this kind of place-based space is to think about in all these different contexts, what are the right set of interventions that are going to be effective at fostering kind of greater um, economic or social integration between these types of communities. So, Acre Homes is a neighborhood that doesn't have a large public housing project, and so you wouldn't literally want to implement Hope 6 again in this community. That wouldn't make sense. But there's many other possible interventions that you could think about implementing. So things like reducing crime, improving public transportation to connect places, investing in public spaces and parks, improving urban design. All of these are examples of things that you might think about trying to do to intervene. And so one of the things that we're working on next is to pick, one of those channels and think about um, can urban design, can the way that we structure the physical layout of a neighborhood and a space shape these types of integration outcomes. So just to give you kind of one, concrete example, digging into the Acre Homes and North Houston example, um, you know, Acre Homes is these two communities are basically cut off by a large kind of vacant plot of land and these two large roads. So if you were living in Acre Homes, it'd actually be pretty difficult to walk over to North Houston just because there's kind of big barriers and the road network is not really set up to foster kind of walkability. And so, one thing that you might think about doing is kind of transforming this big vacant plot into a public park or community space, something that might try to bring residents from Acre Homes and the North Houston communities together. So that's just kind of one example of how you might try to improve urban design in a targeted way to bring together people from different neighborhoods. So that's kind of on our future agenda of thinking more carefully about how urban design shapes interaction and how you might be able to use kind of big data to accurately target investments in urban design. But again, that's just kind of one way that you could think about trying to generate more interaction between people. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to do in this space, both again in the practitioner and policy side of thinking about how we can bring together people from different neighborhoods. So I'll stop there. Thank you again so much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate that. I think we're going to take questions to the very end. because we have a few that are in already. I do want to start off with just acknowledging that the Hope 6 program, as implemented, was not a perfect kind of program. And talk through some of the limitations or serious concerns that people really bring up when they think about Hope 6, just so people have that context.
Yeah, great question. And this is probably something I should have touched on early in the talk. So, Hope 6 was extremely controversial. And the main reason that it was controversial is that there were, a lot of concerns about displacement. And so, one thing that we want to be clear is that we are not kind of endorsing Hope 6 or saying that it necessarily was a good program. Our paper was kind of narrowly looking at whether the program improved the neighborhoods themselves. It is definitely true that most of the families that originally lived in these communities did not stick around and were not able to kind of benefit from these improved environments.
Right.
We don't focus on that in our paper precisely because there's been a lot of other really great work kind of documenting those displacement effects. And so I think that if you were to kind of really think about implementing a program like Hope 6, you'd want to seriously kind of weigh the costs and benefits. So, we document some benefits of the program. It increased economic opportunity in these places, but you'd obviously want to weigh those against the kind of displacement concerns. I think more practically, looking forward, the real lesson from Hope 6 is not that we should basically like implement Hope 6 just as it existed in its early form, but that we should think about whether there are other ways to implement interventions that achieve the same outcomes as Hope 6 that are, less costly, both in terms of kind of a human cost of displacement, but also a financial cost. I guess one example of that is the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, which is the kind of modern equivalent of Hope 6. And so Choice Neighborhoods in many ways resembles the programmatic design of Hope 6, but it improves on it in a number of ways. And I think one really important way that the Choice program improves on Hope 6 is to really think much more carefully about these displacement costs. So doing things like staggered redevelopment instead of kind of knocking down the whole neighborhood and rebuilding, that seems to be much more effective, not surprisingly, at helping people kind of stay put in these neighborhoods. And so, even if you were interested in doing kind of like whole scale neighborhood redevelopment, I think you'd want to take lessons, from the kind of displacement costs of Hope 6 and think about how you can really kind of try to minimize those costs.
That's great. There is a related question to that. So, learning from the Hope 6 style opportunities, you talked about choice neighborhoods, promise neighborhoods, anchors in education, and some of those can come together to blend a variety of strategies. But there's a question here about, are there any states or cities that we should be looking at for inspiration for a scaled kind of revitalization or kind of social integration strategy?
Yeah, I mean, so there's great work being done in the public space. So Choice Neighborhoods, I think, is a good example of a program that like I mentioned, builds on Hope 6. Um, there's also lots of kind of nonprofits that are working in this space that appear to be doing great work. So Purpose Built Communities is an example of an organization who actually their CEO, Carol Naughton, was involved in some of the early Hope 6 sites in Atlanta. And so, her organization, Purpose Built, is another organization that I think is really taking some of the lessons from Hope 6 and trying to think about how do you really revitalize neighborhoods. There's other groups that are involved either in choice neighborhoods or other initiatives that are really focused on kind of like the people side of providing services to these residents. So programs like Urban Strategies Inc. and the Community Builders, I think, are doing great work in this space. And then probably the most kind of targeted example that I've seen of a project really trying to kind of create exactly these kind of cross-class interactions is some much more kind of recent experimental work in one of the choice neighborhoods in Cleveland, which is being led by a group NP3, where they're really explicitly trying to think about um, how do you create these kind of spaces and institutions that are actually going to generate more social interaction, particularly across class lines. So I think there's in the practitioner space, there's tons of examples of people doing great work in this area. On the evidence side, I think we're a bit lacking there. So hopefully, in the years to come on the research side, we're able to kind of catch up and provide some more guidance on what types of interventions that are being implemented today actually seem to be most effective at creating more interaction.
Great. Thanks for that. Um, there is a question here on sort of the evidence side. So, what research do you have in progress or do you know of that is tracking sort of this place-based revitalization kind of effort and how it impacts both kind of the built environment and the conditions in the built environment, but also tracking the improvements of the people who were living there before and after. So, is there any like straight line longitudinal work happening, basically, for the people side in place-based kind of initiatives?
Um, so I think these are kind of more so there's lots of work for sure being done in this place. There's not like a single kind of effort that I'm familiar with that's trying to kind of document the impacts of all the different place-based work that's going on. That was actually when we started this project on Hope 6, that was actually the original ambition of trying to basically build a data set of what are all the Hope 6 or the all the place-based efforts that are being implemented out there, and then we were going to try to study the kind of combined effect of all those programs. Turns out that was a bit ambitious and like very difficult to do in practice, and so most of what's going on in the research space are people studying particular programs. So Hope 6, just because of its size, its importance, its focus on really some of the most distressed communities in the country, and also now the fact that it was implemented long enough ago that we can observe really long run outcomes. That Hope 6, I think, is like the kind of most well studied intervention in this space. And so, our paper is one of many that have looked at Hope 6. Our paper is unique in the sense that we are able to document the kind of changes in the neighborhood conditions after and show that the kids who grow out there after the intervention ultimately end up doing better in life. But there's lots of other papers on this, including some of my own earlier work, kind of studying also, how the neighborhood changed, what happened to the original residents, and so on. So I think, yeah, in general, there's lots of work being done on place-based initiatives, but typically that work is happening kind of program by program with, not surprisingly, like the biggest programs like Hope 6 getting the majority of the focus in this space,
Got it.
at
Great.
least on the quantitative side.
Okay, thanks. There was a clarifying question around defining what you meant when you said isolated. So those isolated kind of neighborhoods versus more integrated neighborhoods, just kind of delving more into that. And then going from there, I think there's a question that's connected, which is you identified those neighborhoods that were sort of candidates for connection-based revitalization. Um, what, let me see how, what would you be encouraging residents to do to try to foster those cross-class connections?
Yeah.
And I guess, are there any creative ideas or efforts underway? You talked a little bit about what might be happening in Cleveland. Maybe you could describe that in a little more detail.
Yeah. So in terms of the measure of social integration, um, so I won't go into too much detail because it gets a little technical, but we basically have many different ways of trying to measure the extent to which like a given neighborhood is socially integrated with kind of surrounding areas. I think the kind of some of these are more complicated than others. The clearest one I think is based on the cell phone records, where essentially what we're doing is we have data from cell phone ping. So, your phone. There are stricter privacy laws in place now, but at least in 2019, your phones were kind of tracking you all the time. Um, and companies would buy up the kind of cell phone pings, and usually that's used for kind of advertising purposes. But we repurposed that for research purposes, so we were able to kind of track cell phone devices over time, the location of them, and using that data, we can observe kind of who the residents of a given neighborhood are. So by kind of observing where the cell phones are pinging during the evening. And then we can follow those cell phone devices throughout the day to measure kind of where they're spending their time. And so, one of the ways that we've measured the extent to which like two different neighborhoods are integrated is just to ask like how much time are people of one neighborhood spending in the other neighborhood. That just gives you some kind of rough approximation of like how much are these people kind of bumping into each other and at least kind of interacting in the same spaces. Of course, you don't know if people are going to kind of the same grocery store and not really interacting versus like going to kind of a public park and like fundamentally like hanging out together. That's something that we're hoping to push on a little bit, but it's at least a rough kind of proxy for inhabiting the same spaces. Um, in terms of kind of uh, uh, pushing on this kind of map of the potential neighborhoods where you might think about trying to implement these efforts. I mean, honestly, I think this is really a space where we just don't have much evidence um, on the policies that are going to be most effective here. There's some earlier research that our lab has conducted using data from Facebook and really digging into those data sets and trying to understand what are the contexts and institutions um, in which people are likely to befriend people from other economic backgrounds, and that really at a fundamental level that kind of is the goal here is trying to find ways of building social connections across class lines. And so, like, a few of the big patterns that jump out from that earlier research with the Facebook data are things like, if you can kind of organize people into smaller groups, that you're more likely to generate interaction. So if you have like big groups of people interacting, often people will kind of bundle off into their own small groups with other people who are just like them. And so trying to find ways of getting people into smaller groups, things like bringing together people for a common purpose. So sports is a good example of that. Religious institutions, so churches are one of the environments that we see the kind of most cross-class interaction in. Um, and so, I think that research kind of hints at some ideas for how you might kind of try to shape interventions and structure spaces to bring people together. But this is a place where I just don't think we have great evidence on what's going to be most effective here. And so a lot of the work is going to take people kind of experimenting on the ground, coming up with their own ideas that seem reasonable given the local context, and then ideally, we'd kind of test those different strategies rigorously and try to figure out kind of what does and doesn't work.
Yeah, Sandy raises a question about studying school zoning and the level of integration within public schools, and then extracurricular opportunities through sports and arts and music and other things that happen outside of the school time, especially if we're seeing the effects on children, which definitely comes to mind for me as well as we kind of look at research in the education space and how integrated schools produce more positive academic outcomes, and some of even just the work that you mentioned through the lab. The fact that it's economic connectedness, there's like the exposure component and there's the friendship component. How do you
Yeah,
actually foster cross-class friendships? That requires time, intimacy, those things that like commonality, those things that you talked about. So I sort of worry about like the urban design like angle, to be honest, because yes, exposure and kind of mingling in spaces and parks are important, but I don't know if that's really going to get us the effects and impact that we actually are striving for. That's just my perspective. Um, but in terms of the last question here, because I think we actually are out of time. Um, let me see. There was a question here about there have been similar interventions over the past 30 years to incentivize affordable housing development in higher income neighborhoods, including LIHTC, home opportunity zones. And the biggest barriers seem to be the residents of higher income communities resisting lower income
Yeah.
residents. Um, even to your point, when there's no meaningful cost, it seems, to those higher income residents. So where have you seen any effective effort or strategy to shift mindsets for higher income residents?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, I think you're right that a lot of the kind of resistance to integration, whether that be school integration or neighborhood integration, comes from a place of high income parents are concerned about the well-being of their kids, and they have this perception that, well, once the neighborhood becomes integrated or the school becomes integrated, maybe my kid is going to get, harmed by that. I think, this set of evidence that we provide in the paper is just one kind of data point in a growing body of evidence to suggest that these concerns may be kind of overstated, that empirically it seems like the gains for low income kids are tend to be much larger than any losses we observe for high income kids. And so, yeah, I guess one of the um, challenges here is to build this evidence base and find a way of communicating it more accurately. And I'm not aware of. I don't know, David, if you have thoughts on this of interventions that seem to be doing a good job at that. I think in some contexts, you do actually find small losses for kids from high income families. And so in those cases, I think it'd actually be important to kind of acknowledge those small losses and find a way of incentivizing the higher income families to be parts of these initiatives. I also think that this type of intervention where um, you're thinking about integration across neighborhood boundaries is potentially another like type of strategy to think about here. So actually integrating neighborhoods may be more difficult than kind of building connections across these communities. And so, yeah, another option here would be finding ways of kind of building those cross-class relationships that don't kind of generate as much tension or backlash would be another strategy.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know we're at time. I just wanted to add, I mean, I think that diagram that I was just showing where there was minimal loss to children from higher income families, I think this is just another example in the research where we're seeing that this concept of economic mobility does not have to be a zero sum scenario, where those who are seeing improvements are those are coming at the expense of others who are then seeing more detrimental outcomes later in life. That's just continually not the story we see in the data, where low-income kids are doing better by certain subgroups, even by race or ethnicity. We also tend to see either minimal declines or improvements in other groups as well. So I think that's just another way to help reframe the conversation, and hopefully this evidence helps support those kinds of pushbacks that we might see from communities where they're resistant to change, that really the impacts of that are positive for the broader community and neighborhood that these folks reside in
Yeah.
or can be.
Yes, thank you both so much. We really appreciate your time and the incredible research. So I know it took Matt, it's been many years. And so really congratulations. And it's hugely important and valuable to the field. So we really appreciate you all joining. And thanks everyone for staying on a few minutes over. We will stay tuned. Our webinar series will continue and we'll be in touch about the next opportunity to learn alongside us. Thanks so much. Have a great day.